In April 1987, a 21-year-old mother in Houston called 911 from her own apartment. Her husband was on the couch with a bullet in his head. Her 7-year-old son was in his bed. Her 21-month-old daughter was in hers. 3 weeks earlier, she had taken out $50,000 life insurance policies on 2 of the 3 people who were now dead. 18 years later, Texas put a needle in her arm. She was still saying she had not done it. Frances Newton was one of 10 women the United States has executed since 1976 who left behind their own children. 10 mothers, 10 death chambers, 10 cases that the legal system processed as ordinary capital murders and that almost nobody has ever examined as a single set. A grandmother who buried 2 husbands in her own yard. A nurse who killed her own babies and thanked the jury for sentencing her to death. A woman who took her teenage son canoeing, wearing 15 pounds of metal on his legs. 10 mothers. This is what the record actually says. Section 1. Velma Barfield, the woman who started it all. Velma Barfield was 52 years old when North Carolina put her to death in the early hours of November 2nd, 1984. She was a grandmother by then. She had spent the better part of 6 years on death row reading scripture, writing letters, and praying in a small cell at the North Carolina Correctional Institution for Women. She had supporters, real ones, serious ones. Billy Graham, one of the most recognized Christian leaders in American history, and his wife Ruth, both spoke on her behalf and urged the governor to spare her life. Dozens of religious groups and private citizens wrote letters. The appeals went all the way through the state courts and the federal courts. Governor Jim Hunt denied every single one. When the lethal injection was administered at Central Prison in Raleigh, Velma Barfield became the first woman executed in the United States since 1962. 22 years had passed since a woman had been put to death anywhere in the country. She was also the first person ever executed by lethal injection, male or female, in the state of North Carolina, and the first woman executed in the entire country by that method. Anywhere the story gets told, these firsts tend to be the headline. What tends not to make the headline is that she was a mother. 2 children, a son and a daughter, both from her first marriage, both of whom were alive when their mother was strapped to a gurney and given a lethal injection at 2 in the morning. One of them, her son Ronnie Burke, spent years publicly trying to process what it meant to grow up as the child of a woman convicted of multiple murders. What that costs a person, what shape that grief takes, is not something that gets neatly resolved. It stays. Velma was born Margie Velma Bullard on October 29, 1932, in a rural part of North Carolina. She grew up in a large family, one of 9 children, raised in a strict Pentecostal Christian household. Her father was reportedly physically abusive, and her mother did not step in to stop it. Home was not a safe place for her, and from the time she was old enough to understand that, she was looking for a way out. She found it at 17. She dropped out of school and married a man named Thomas Burke. They moved to Parkton, North Carolina, and for a period of years things were quiet. They had 2 children together. Burke worked, Velma kept the home. The life they built was modest but stable. Then Burke began drinking heavily. The arguments between them grew worse over time. The drinking ate away at the steady life they had built. Burke would come home in a state. Sometimes he would sleep it off. Sometimes the night would go badly. The children were old enough by then to know what a bad night looked like. A house where a parent drinks heavily is not a quiet house, and the Burke home in those years was not quiet. In April 1965, Velma and the children left the house for a period while Burke was drunk inside. When they came back, the house was on fire, and Thomas Burke was dead. The fire was ruled accidental. An investigation found nothing that pointed to foul play with any certainty. Velma collected the life insurance money from his death and moved forward. Nobody looked closely enough at the time to ask hard questions. That would become a pattern. What followed Burke's death was a long, slow collapse. Velma was alone with 2 children, managing physical pain from a medical procedure and the weight of everything that had come before. Doctors began prescribing medication, tranquilizers for anxiety, sleeping pills for insomnia, antidepressants. barbiturates. What started as a medical response to real problems became something she could not stop. By the early 1970s, Velma Barfield was deeply addicted to prescription drugs. Not the street drugs that tend to dominate public imagination when people think about addiction, but the kind that came in bottles from pharmacies, prescribed by doctors, legal and invisible and relentless. The pills kept coming because the pain kept coming. One doctor would write a prescription. Another doctor at a different office would write another. There were no shared records back then in the way there are now, and a woman moving between doctors could end up with shelves full of medication and nobody checking the total. Velma was not unusual in this. Plenty of women across the South in the 1970s ended up in the same place she did, with bottles lining the bathroom cabinet and a body that had stopped working without them. What was unusual was where the addiction eventually led her. Between 1972 and 1975, she was admitted to the hospital 4 separate times for overdoses. In 1975, she spent 6 months in prison for writing bad checks. She had been stealing money to pay for the medication. That is what addiction does to the math of a life. It makes stealing seem like the only arithmetic that works. She remarried after Burke's death. Her second husband, Jennings Barfield, also died. Again, the cause of death was attributed to natural causes. Again, Velma collected insurance money. No investigation followed. By 1977, she was working as a home health nurse, a job that placed her inside the homes of elderly and sick people who needed around-the-clock care. She was also in a relationship with a widower farmer named Stuart Taylor. Her nursing cases that year included a married couple, Montgomery Edwards, 94 years old, and his wife Dolly, 84. Montgomery Edwards died in January 1977. His wife Dolly died just weeks later, both of them having developed what appeared to be a severe stomach illness. Another of Velma's patients, a man named John Henry Lee, died in June of that same year after a similar sudden stomach sickness. 3 deaths, all attributed to natural causes, all in homes where Velma Barfield had been present and working. Still nobody connected the dots. The thing that finally broke the pattern open was Stuart Taylor. Velma had been forging checks from his account to fund her drug habit. She became convinced that he had discovered what she had been doing. The fear of exposure, of losing him, of going back to prison, of having everything come apart, pushed her to the same response she had reached before. She mixed arsenic-based rat poison into his beer and into his tea. Taylor became severely ill within days. He deteriorated fast. Velma drove him to the hospital herself and stayed with him there. He died a few days after being admitted. His family pressed for answers. An autopsy was ordered. The results came back identifying arsenic as the cause of death. Velma Barfield was arrested on May 13, 1978, and charged with his murder. Once investigators began looking properly, the past came into sharp focus. The deaths of Montgomery and Dolly Edwards, of John Henry Lee, and of her own mother, Lillian Bullard, were all re-examined. Velma eventually confessed to poisoning 4 people. She said in each case that she had only meant to make them sick, not to kill them. She said she had poisoned them to buy herself time to put back the money she had stolen before anyone noticed it was gone. She said things went further than she intended. Whether that is an honest account or a story constructed to make the crimes seem less deliberate, there is no way to prove with certainty. What is provable is that 4 people are dead, and that arsenic poisoning was the cause in each confirmed case. Her trial focused specifically on the murder of Stuart Taylor. The defense put forward an insanity plea, arguing that her addiction and her mental state had left her unable to fully understand what she was doing or control her actions. The jury rejected that argument without much deliberation. They found her guilty of first-degree murder and recommended death. During the trial, there was a moment that left a mark on everyone who witnessed it. Throughout the proceedings, Velma had appeared distant and unmoved in a way that made the jury deeply uncomfortable. When the district attorney finished his closing speech, Velma Barfield gave him a round of applause. It was not sarcastic. It did not appear to be a performance. Observers at the time described it as genuinely disorienting. A woman on trial for her life, applauding the man who was trying to put her to death. Whether it was a product of her medication, a kind of emotional numbness, or something else entirely, nobody ever fully explained it. The jury saw what they saw. She was sentenced to death in December 1978. The years that followed were different from what the trial had suggested she was capable of. Velma Barfield stopped using prescription drugs while on death row. She began attending religious services. She counselled other inmates. She wrote letters. She completed Bible study courses. She became, by the accounts of correctional staff and fellow inmates who knew her during those years, a genuinely changed presence. Quieter, more careful, more honest about what she had done and why. The governor's office received a steady stream of appeals on her behalf. Religious groups wrote in, private citizens wrote in. Billy Graham and Ruth Graham used their considerable public platform to argue that the woman currently sitting on death row was not the woman who had committed those crimes, and that executing her served no purpose justice required. A convicted serial poisoner had somehow become a cause that drew sympathy from some of the most well-known Christians in the country. Jim Hunt was running for a US Senate seat during the period when the final clemency decisions were being made. Some observers pointed out afterward that a governor-seeking election in the South in 1984 would have faced enormous political pressure to appear tough on crime, and that refusing clemency to a woman who had poisoned multiple people over a decade, even a woman who appeared genuinely changed, was the easier political path. Whether that calculation played a role is impossible to establish definitively. The denials came regardless, one after another, until the legal road ran out. On the night of November 1st, 1984, Velma Barfield received communion in her cell. She spent the hours before dawn in prayer. She had requested that she be allowed to wear pink pajamas instead of the standard prison uniform, the same pajamas she asked to be buried in. The request was granted. At 2 a.m. on November 2nd, 1984, at Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina, the lethal injection was administered. Velma Barfield was pronounced dead a short time later. She was 52 years old. The history books record the firsts. First woman executed since 1962. First by lethal injection. First woman put to death in North Carolina in 40 years. These are the facts that get passed down. What gets passed over is the shape of the life behind those facts. A childhood built on fear. A marriage that ended in fire. 20 years of prescription drug addiction that turned theft into reflex, and reflex into something far worse. 2 children who had to carry the name Barfield into the rest of their lives. A son who spent years processing what it meant to grieve someone who may have killed his father. None of that makes what she did acceptable. The 4 people she poisoned were real people, with their own families and their own lives. Stuart Taylor trusted her. Montgomery Edwards and Dolly Edwards trusted her. She used that trust to kill them. Both things are true. They have always been true at the same time. The 9 cases that follow this one are each different in their details. Different crimes, different states, different decades. But the structure underneath all of them carries something of what Velma Barfield's story already contains. A woman who was also a mother, judged by a system that had almost no framework for holding both of those things together. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Judy Buenoano killed more people than Velma Barfield. She killed over a longer period of time. She was more systematic, more deliberate, and harder to catch. And one of the people she killed was her own son, a 19-year-old boy she had spent years slowly poisoning before taking him out on a river and making sure he drowned. Section 2. Judy Buenoano, the Black Widow. Judy Buenoano spent the last moments of her life in an electric chair at Florida State Prison on the morning of March 30th, 1998. She was 54 years old. She made no final statement. Guards described her as frail-looking when they helped her walk into the death chamber. She was strapped into a large oaken chair that seemed built for someone much bigger. When asked if she had any last words, she closed her eyes and said no. The power was turned on at 7:08 a.m. Smoke rose from her right leg throughout the 38 seconds it took for the current to kill her. She was pronounced dead at 7:13 a.m. She maintained her innocence to the end. 3 people are confirmed to have died at her hands. A 4th barely survived. A 5th and possibly 6th may have been her victims as well, though charges were never brought in those cases. The people she killed were her husband, her boyfriend, and her son. Her son was 19 years old. She had been poisoning him for years before she took him out on a river and made sure he drowned. That is the case of Judy Buenoano. She was born Judius Anna Lou Welty on April 4th, 1943, in Quanah, Texas. Almost nothing about her early life was easy. She was poor, she moved often, and by the time she reached adulthood, she had already learned that survival required a certain amount of invention. She reinvented herself more than once: names, locations, histories. By the time the state of Florida executed her, she had been known as Judius Welty, Judius Goodyear, Judy Morris, and Judius Buenoano. The name she settled on, Buenoano, was one she created herself. It is the Spanish translation of Goodyear. She changed it legally after her first husband died. James Goodyear was an Air Force sergeant. He and Judy married in 1963. They had 3 children together. By all outward appearances, they were a military family doing what military families do: moving when ordered, building something stable out of the uncertainty that comes with that life. James Goodyear served in Vietnam. When he came home in 1971, he began feeling sick shortly after his return. He went to a naval hospital in September of that year, complaining of stomach pain and vomiting. His condition got worse fast. 3 days after being admitted, he died of cardiovascular collapse and renal failure. He was 33 years old. The cause of death raised no alarms at the time. Judy Goodyear collected his life insurance and moved on. No autopsy was ordered. No questions were asked about the pattern of his illness. The death was logged, the paperwork was processed, and the investigation that should have happened did not happen for another 13 years. In the years that followed, Judy, now calling herself Judy Morris, moved to Colorado and began a relationship with a man named Bobby Joe Morris. Bobby Joe Morris became ill. He died in 1978 from what appeared at the time to be a sudden illness. Judy Morris collected his insurance money, moved back to Florida, and changed her name once more. She became Judius Buenoano. She opened a beauty salon in Pensacola and began building a new version of her life. The salon gave her a face the town could recognize. She was visible in a way that a person hiding something is usually not visible. Customers came in and out. She knew their names. She did their hair. She talked about her children, about the salon, about ordinary things. Pensacola in the late 1970s was the kind of place where a woman could open a small business and become known as the owner of that business and have that be the version of her that everybody around her saw. Her son Michael was grown by this point. He had enlisted in the army. Judy encouraged it. What none of the people around her understood yet was that Michael had already been getting sick for some time. In 1979, he was diagnosed with a condition that left him unable to use his arms and legs properly. Post-mortem examination would later determine that the cause of this was severe arsenic poisoning, arsenic that had been building up in his body over a prolonged period. The poisoning had been so sustained that it left Michael partially paralysed. He was given heavy metal braces for his legs to help him walk. The army doctors who treated Michael did not identify arsenic as the cause. The symptoms looked like something else to them: nerve damage, a condition of the body's own making. Michael was honourably discharged because he could no longer perform as a soldier. He came home to live with his family. He wore the braces because he had to. He moved more slowly than a man his age should have moved. None of the people around him, including the doctors who had examined him, understood that what was wrong with him had been put into him by someone he trusted. In May 1980, Judy Buenoano took Michael, then 19 years old, and his younger brother James out canoeing on the East River. The canoe capsized. James and Judy were able to get out from under the overturned canoe and swim to safety. Michael could not. He was weighed down by 15 pounds of metal leg braces. He had been given no life jacket. He sank and drowned. Judy Buenoano filed an insurance claim. She received $125,000. The investigation that should have followed Michael's death was not thorough enough. The drowning was treated as a tragic accident. A 19-year-old boy had gone canoeing with his mother and his brother. The canoe had tipped, and he had not been able to save himself. It was terrible, it was sad, and it was accepted as something that can simply happen on a river. Nobody looked at the arsenic already present in Michael's body. Nobody looked at the metal braces that had made him unable to swim. Nobody looked at the insurance policy. Judy continued. She began a relationship with a businessman named John Gentry. Things moved quickly. The couple got engaged. In October 1982, Judy convinced John to take out life insurance policies on both of them, with each named as the other's beneficiary. She also began giving him special vitamin supplements. John started feeling unwell in December 1982 and was hospitalized. While in the hospital, without the vitamins, he began to feel better. He was discharged. He did not connect the vitamins to the illness. He had no reason to. On June 25, 1983, John Gentry walked out to his car, got in, and turned the key. A bomb exploded under the vehicle. The explosion was serious enough to cause significant injuries, but John Gentry survived. That survival is the reason Judy Buenoano was caught. While John Gentry was recovering in hospital, investigators began looking into the details of the bombing. They found that Judy had been giving him pills containing arsenic. That single discovery opened everything else. Investigators pulled the thread, and the whole thing came undone. They looked at Michael's death and at the arsenic found in his body. They looked at the insurance payout that followed his drowning. They looked at Bobby Joe Morris's death in Colorado. They looked at James Goodyear's death in 1971. Both bodies were exhumed, Morris and Goodyear, and both were found to contain lethal amounts of arsenic. 3 people dead by arsenic poisoning across 12 years in 3 different states. A 4th person nearly killed by a car bomb. Life insurance collected after each death. Judy Buenoano had not hidden in plain sight so much as she had relied on each individual death being examined in complete isolation from the others. The moment anyone laid them side by side, the pattern was obvious and overwhelming. She was arrested in January 1984. The charges came in stages. She was convicted of the attempted murder of John Gentry in 1984 and sentenced to 12 years in prison. That same year, she received a life sentence for the murder of her son Michael. In 1985, she was sentenced to death for the first-degree murder of James Goodyear, the husband who had died in 1971, whose death had not been properly examined until 13 years after the fact. The trial for James Goodyear's murder laid out what the prosecution believed had been her method and her motive in consistent terms. She poisoned people who were close to her, waited for them to die, and collected the money their deaths released. The insurance policies were not coincidences, the illnesses were not bad luck, the deaths were not natural. Each one followed the same basic shape: a period of sickness, a hospitalization, a death, a payout, and each one left Judy Buenoano in a financially better position than she had been before. What the trial could not fully answer, and what has continued to sit uncomfortably in the record ever since, is the question of Michael. He was her son. She had raised him. Whatever had been wrong or difficult or broken in the life she built with James Goodyear, Michael had nothing to do with it. He had been a child in that house. By the time she was poisoning him, he was a young man who had joined the army and was trying to build a life of his own. The arsenic that eventually paralyzed him had been introduced into his body over a period of time. This was not a single act of desperation or a moment of panic that went wrong. The poisoning of Michael Buenoano was gradual and sustained, and when the paralysis had progressed far enough that he needed metal braces to walk, when his body had been damaged to a point where he could not effectively swim, his mother took him out on a river and capsized the boat. He was wearing 15 pounds of metal on his legs. He had no life jacket. He had no chance. The insurance policy on Michael's life paid out $125,000 after his death. Judy Buenoano sat on death row in Florida for 13 years before her execution. During that time, she continued to maintain that she had not killed anyone. She filed appeal after appeal. Each one was denied. The Florida Supreme Court reviewed her case multiple times, The federal courts reviewed it. The United States Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit had already upheld the denial of her first federal appeal years earlier, and by 1998, the legal roads had all closed. Her execution on March 30th, 1998 made her the first woman executed in Florida since 1848, a gap of 150 years between the state putting one woman to death and putting the next one to death. She was only the third woman executed anywhere in the United States since the reinstatement of capital punishment in 1976. The framing that followed her case in public life settled quickly around the nickname that journalists and true crime writers attached to her, the Black Widow. It is a name built on a specific image, the spider that kills its mate, the woman who destroys the men in her life for personal gain. That framing is not entirely wrong. She did kill her husband. She did kill her boyfriend. She did collect their insurance money. But Michael does not fit the Black Widow narrative cleanly. Michael was her son, not her romantic partner. He was not someone she stood to inherit from in the ordinary sense. His death required a different explanation than simple husband killing for profit. And the explanation the evidence points toward: a mother who poisoned her own child slowly over time, watched the damage accumulate in his body, then drowned him when the moment came, is harder to contain inside a single clean label. She had 3 children total. 2 of them outlived her. One of them died on a river because she put him there and made sure he stayed under. 3 mothers appear in the first 2 sections of this video: Velma Barfield, who poisoned people around her to cover stolen money, and Judy Buenoano, who poisoned her way through a succession of relationships and her own son. Both of them, in the end, were executed by states that had almost no prior experience executing women. Both of them maintained innocence. Neither of them showed the kind of public grief or obvious remorse that might have shifted the conversation around their cases. Barfield had the religious conversion, the Billy Graham letters, the pink pajamas. Buenoano had nothing like that. She walked into the electric chair silent and frail and was gone in 38 seconds. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The cases that follow move into a different kind of territory. Velma Barfield killed people around her to manage her addiction. Judy Buenoano killed people around her for money. The next case involves a woman who killed her own 2 children and then walked into court and asked the jury to kill her too. Section 3. Christina Riggs, the mother who asked to die. Christina Riggs was a licensed nurse. She understood how the human body worked. She understood medication, she understood dosage, and she understood what it took to end a life. That knowledge was part of her professional training. On the night she decided to kill herself, she used everything she knew. She took 28 Elavil tablets. A normal dose would have been a fraction of that number. The amount she swallowed was, under ordinary circumstances, enough to be fatal. She followed the tablets by injecting herself with enough undiluted potassium chloride to kill 5 people. Then she waited for it to be over. Her body refused to let her die. Police found Christina Riggs the next morning, still alive, in her apartment in Sherwood, Arkansas. Her 2 young children were in their beds. Both of them were dead. She had smothered them in the night before she tried to kill herself. She had written notes explaining what she had done and why. In those notes, she described not being able to go on living the way she had been living. She wrote that she could not bear to leave her children behind, could not face the idea of them being raised apart from their fathers, could not accept the thought of them growing up knowing their mother had killed herself. So she made a decision that she believed, in whatever state of mind she was in that night, was the only way to keep them from suffering what she was about to do to herself. She killed them first. Then she tried to follow. The 2 children had names. Justin was 5 years old, Shelby was 2. Justin was the older of the 2, old enough to talk, old enough to ask questions about the world, old enough to have a personality that the people who knew him would have recognized. Shelby was still a baby in many of the ways that matter, still learning, still growing into the person she was going to be. Their mother loved them. That part is not in question and never was. The notes she left made the love clear. What the notes also made clear was that the love had become tangled up with a kind of suffering that no longer let her see the world the way the rest of the world saw it. When the attempt on her own life failed, and police brought her to hospital, The medical staff who treated her were also the people who began to understand what had happened inside that apartment. The children were dead. Christina Riggs was alive. She was taken into custody. She was 27 years old. Arkansas prosecutors charged her with capital murder. The case moved to trial. During the guilt phase, the jury heard the facts of what had happened: the deaths of the children, the suicide notes, the self-administered overdose, the survival. The jury found her guilty of murder. Then came the penalty phase. This is the part of a capital trial where the jury decides whether the person convicted deserves to spend the rest of their life in prison or whether they deserve to die. It is the part of the process where defense attorneys typically bring in everything they can to argue for mercy: mental health history, childhood trauma, mitigating factors, anything that might give the jury a reason to choose life over death. Christina Riggs would not allow any of that. She instructed her attorneys not to mount a defense during the penalty phase. She told the court, clearly and directly, that she wanted the death sentence. She did not want to be argued for. She did not want to be saved. She wanted the jury to give her what she had already tried to give herself and failed. The jury obliged. When the death sentence was formally handed down, Christina Riggs looked at her attorney and said thank you. She squeezed her attorney's hand. She was grateful. That detail is one of the strangest and most devastating in the entire history of women on death row in the United States. A woman thanking the court for sentencing her to death. A woman who could not complete the act herself and so, in some deeply broken way, was counting on the state of Arkansas to finish what she had started. She was sent to death row. The years between her conviction and her execution were not quiet ones, legally speaking. Her attorneys continued to file appeals even without her cooperation, because that is what capital defense attorneys are required to do. Some people on the outside argued that her death sentence should be reconsidered, that a woman in the depths of severe depression who had tried to kill herself in the same act was not the same as a person who had committed premeditated murder for personal gain, that the distinction between what Christina Riggs did and what a person like Velma Barfield or Judy Buenoano did was significant enough to be weighed differently. Others argued that the death of two children could not be measured or softened by the mental state of the person who killed them, that the children had no say in what their mother decided, that mercy shown to Christina Riggs was a kind of forgetting of them. Both positions were argued. The courts reviewed the case. The appeals were denied. The execution was scheduled. On May 2, 2000, Christina Riggs was brought to the execution chamber in Arkansas. She was 28 years old. She had been on death row for roughly 2 years. The lethal injection was prepared and administered. Before she lost consciousness, she spoke. Her final words were directed at her children. She said she loved them, using the word babies. She was pronounced dead shortly after. She became the first woman executed in the state of Arkansas. The case of Christina Riggs forces a specific kind of discomfort that most true crime stories do not produce. The discomfort does not come from uncertainty. There is no mystery here, no question about who did what. Christina Riggs killed her children and then tried to kill herself. She told the court what happened and she asked for death. There is no disputed evidence, no contested forensics, no alternative theory. The discomfort comes from what the case asks about the nature of that act. Whether the killing of her children was a crime in the way most murders are crimes, deliberate, self-interested, calculated, or whether it was something that happened inside a mind so consumed by depression that the ordinary logic of the word murder does not fully apply. These are not questions with clean answers. They sit in the record of the case and stay there. What is known with certainty is this: Christina Riggs was a single mother working as a nurse. She had 2 young children by different fathers, and the note she left behind described the weight of managing that alone as something she could no longer carry. Depression is a real illness. It distorts thinking in ways that can make the worst possible option feel like the only one. The decision she made that night, that killing her children before she killed herself was somehow an act of protection rather than harm, is the kind of thinking that severe depression produces. It does not reflect reality. The children were not protected by what she did. They were killed. But the state of her mind matters to the record, even if it did not matter to the outcome. It matters because it shapes what kind of case this actually was. Not the case of a predator, not the case of a woman who killed for money or to escape a relationship, but the case of someone so lost inside her own suffering that she could no longer distinguish between harm and protection. Arkansas did not distinguish between those things either, at least not in any way that changed the sentence. The jury heard the facts, the jury heard the context, and the jury gave her exactly what she had asked for. She said thank you. There is a version of this story that centres entirely on the children, on the fact that two small children who had no ability to defend themselves or understand what was happening to them were killed in their beds by their mother. That version of the story is not wrong, it is essential. The children existed. They had lives ahead of them that were taken away in the night. Whatever their mother was going through, they were not part of the decision-making. They were simply there, in their beds, in their home, and then they were gone. There is another version of this story that sits alongside the first, the version that looks at what Christina Riggs was, what she was experiencing, and what she believed she was doing. Both versions are true. Both versions are uncomfortable. The case does not resolve into something simple, no matter which direction it is examined from. What can be said clearly is that the state of Arkansas put her to death on May 2nd, 2000. She was 28 years old. She had asked for it. She died saying she loved her children. Whether that love, as real as it clearly was, can be reconciled with what she did to them is not a question that gets resolved by the execution. The execution happened. The question remains. She is the third woman to appear in this list. The first two, Barfield and Buenoano, killed people who were not their primary intended victims, people around them, people whose deaths served a financial or practical purpose. Christina Riggs killed the people she was supposed to protect above all others, and she asked for death, not as an escape from punishment, but as an extension of the act itself, a completion of something she had started and could not finish on her own. That is what makes this case sit differently from the ones before it, and it is what makes the case that follows sit differently still. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Betty Lou Beets was 62 years old when Texas executed her. She had 5 children and 9 grandchildren and 6 great-grandchildren. One of those children helped her hide a body in the front yard of the house where the rest of the family lived. And the man buried in that yard was not the only husband she had put in the ground. Section 4. Betty Lou Beets. What the yard was hiding. Betty Lou Beets was 62 years old when the state of Texas put her to death on February 24, 2000. She had 5 children, 9 grandchildren, and 6 great-grandchildren. She had been married 5 times. At the moment the lethal injection was administered, she was one of the oldest women executed in the United States during the modern era of capital punishment. She did not make a final statement. She did not request a last meal. She was strapped to the gurney, the injection was given, and she was gone. 2 of her husbands were buried on her property. One of them had been missing for years before anyone found him. The story of Betty Lou Beets does not have the same texture as the cases that came before it. Velma Barfield was driven by addiction. Judy Buenoano was driven by insurance money collected systematically over a decade. Christina Riggs was driven by a depression so severe she could no longer tell protection from destruction. Betty Lou Beets was driven by something that looked, on the surface, more ordinary. A woman in a bad marriage. A woman who had been in several bad marriages. A woman who found one specific solution and used it more than once. What makes her case extraordinary is not the motive. The motive is almost plain by the standards of this list. What makes it extraordinary is the geography of it. The bodies in the yard, the family that kept the secret, the years that passed before the ground gave anything up. She was born in the early 1930s and had 5 children by the time she reached middle age. Her marriages were troubled in ways that left marks. She had been, by various accounts, the victim of domestic abuse across multiple relationships. Whether that history shaped what she eventually did is something her defense team tried to argue at trial. The jury weighed it and reached their conclusion regardless. The pattern of her life by the early 1980s was the pattern of someone who had been married and unmarried more times than most people manage in a lifetime. Some of the marriages ended in divorce. Some of them ended in ways that the official record at the time accepted without much scrutiny. A man would be there and then not be there. Paperwork would be filed. Life would move on. Henderson County in the early 1980s was rural enough and quiet enough that a person could disappear from one family and reappear in nobody's records. And a woman with a complicated marriage history could keep moving forward without anyone laying her past out on a single page. Her fifth husband was a man named Jimmy Don Beets. They lived together in Henderson County, Texas, on a property near a lake. Jimmy Don Beets was a retired fire captain. By 1983, the marriage had deteriorated. Betty Lou had a son from a previous relationship named Robert Branson, and he was living nearby. At some point before August 1983, Betty Lou told Robert that she intended to kill Jimmy Don. She told him to leave the house and give her time alone with her husband. Robert left. He came back roughly 2 hours later and found his stepfather dead. Jimmy Don Beets had been shot twice. Robert Branson helped his mother move the body. They wrapped it and buried it in the front yard of the property, beneath what was described as a wishing well. When the burial was done, Betty Lou Beets called the police and reported that her husband had gone missing. The report was accepted. An investigation followed, but it did not uncover the body. Jimmy Don Beets was entered into the missing persons record. His family pressed for answers over the years that followed. They did not get them immediately. The yard held its secret for a while. In 1983, the same year Jimmy Don disappeared, Betty Lou collected on his life insurance policy. She also eventually sought to collect his pension and survivor benefits as his widow, which required legal proceedings to have him officially declared dead. This process, the paperwork, the legal manoeuvring, the formal declaration of death for a man whose body was 30 feet from the front door, continued for some time before investigators began taking a closer look. By 1985, law enforcement had enough reason to search the property. What they found when they dug was worse than a single body. Jimmy Don Beets was there, beneath the wishing well, and in a storage shed on the same property, they found the remains of Doyle Wayne Baker, Betty Lou's fourth husband, who had also been reported missing years earlier and whose disappearance had also never been resolved. 2 husbands, 2 graves, the same piece of land. Betty Lou Beets was arrested and charged with the capital murder of Jimmy Don Beets. The prosecution's case rested on the physical evidence recovered from the property, the testimony of her son, Robert Branson, the insurance claims she had filed, and the pattern of her marriages. The missing husbands, the insurance payouts, the bodies that eventually turned up on land she controlled. Robert Branson's testimony was the most damaging single element. He was her son. He had been there. He had helped her move the body and bury it. He then sat in a courtroom and told a jury exactly what he had seen and done. That decision, to testify against his own mother, is the kind of thing that does not happen in a family unless the situation has passed a point of no return. He was not compelled to invent anything. He was there when it happened, and he described what he had seen. The weight of what Robert Branson had been carrying for years before he ever spoke in that courtroom is something the record does not fully capture. He was a young man when he helped bury Jimmy Don Beets. He went home that night knowing what was under the ground in front of his mother's house. He watched her file the missing person report. He watched her collect the insurance money. He watched the family of his stepfather search for answers that he already had. Whatever he had been told as a child about loyalty to family, about silence, about what a son does for a mother who asks something of him, whatever shape those lessons had taken in his particular family, the burden of carrying that secret for 2 years was the burden he was carrying right up until he chose not to carry it anymore. The defense did not dispute the basic facts of what had been found on the property. Their argument centered on the context of Betty Lou Beets' life, the abuse she had suffered across her marriages, the circumstances that had shaped her by the time she reached her 50s. They argued that a full understanding of who she was required accounting for the harm that had been done to her before any of this began. The jury heard those arguments and returned a death sentence regardless. The case moved through the appeals process over the following years. Betty Lou Beets was in her late 50s and then her early 60s during this period. Each appeal argued that the death sentence was inappropriate for reasons ranging from her age and background to the quality of the legal representation she had received at trial. Each appeal was denied. There was also a legal argument made during the appeals process about the Texas law that was in place at the time of her trial, specifically around whether jurors had been properly instructed on how to consider mitigating factors, the details of a person's background and circumstances that might argue for a lesser sentence. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals reviewed this and ultimately did not find it sufficient to change the outcome. On February 24, 2000, Betty Lou Beets was executed at the Huntsville unit in Texas. She was 62 years old. She had 5 children, 9 grandchildren, and 6 great-grandchildren, all of them still living at the time of her death. She made no statement. She asked for nothing. The image of the execution is stark in a particular way. A 62-year-old grandmother strapped to a gurney, executed by a state she had lived in her whole life, for the murder of a husband buried in her own front yard. That image sits uncomfortably against the instinct most people carry about what a grandmother is supposed to represent. A grandmother is supposed to be safe. A grandmother is supposed to be the person at the end of the family line who holds things together, who bakes things and remembers birthdays and is called on in a crisis because she is steady and wise and a source of comfort. Betty Lou Beets was a grandmother who shot her husband twice, had her son help her move the body, buried it under a decorative structure in the front yard of the family home, called the police to report a missing person, filed the life insurance claim, and kept the secret long enough that the man's family spent years without knowing what had happened to him. Both of those things are true of the same person. A grandmother, a killer. A woman who told her son to leave the house before she did it, and who accepted his help covering it up afterward. Robert Branson had to carry that. He helped bury the body. He then testified against the person who asked him to help. Whatever came after that, the trial, the years of appeals, the execution, he was present for all of it as the son who had been inside the events from the beginning. What that does to a person over 2 decades is not something that gets resolved by a verdict or an execution date. The property had 2 graves on it. The detail about Doyle Wayne Baker, the 4th husband, found in the shed, received less attention than Jimmy Don Beets during the trial because the charge was specifically for Jimmy Don's murder. Doyle Wayne Baker's case was examined, but no separate capital charge was pursued in the same proceedings. He was there too, on the same land, in the same shed, dead before anyone had started looking. Betty Lou Beets maintained until late in her life that the violence in her marriages had been done to her first. Her legal team argued this throughout the appeals process. Whether that is something the legal system was equipped to weigh properly against the evidence of 2 buried husbands is a question that people continue to argue about in the context of her case. The courts made their determination. The execution happened. She was the 3rd woman executed in Texas since the reinstatement of capital punishment. The first had been Carla Faye Tucker in 1998. The second was Betty Lou Beets herself in 2000. The third would come 5 years later, and that case would raise a different kind of question entirely, about forensic evidence and the reliability of a crime lab, and about what it means to put someone to death when the science used to convict them is later found to be deeply compromised. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That 3rd woman was a mother too. She was 21 years old when she allegedly committed the crime she was convicted of. Her children were 7 years old and 21 months old. She maintained her innocence for 18 years. She was still maintaining it when they killed her. Section 5. Frances Newton, 18 years of saying no. Frances Newton was 21 years old on the night of April 7, 1987. She had a husband named Adrian. She had a 7-year-old son named Alton. She had a 21-month-old daughter named Farrah. By the end of that night, all 3 of them were dead in their apartment in Houston, Texas. Adrian was on the couch, shot in the head. Alton was in his bed, shot in the chest. Farrah was in her bed, shot in the chest. Frances Newton was executed for those 3 murders on September 14, 2005. She was 40 years old. She had spent 18 years saying she did not do it. The facts of the case, as the prosecution laid them out, were built on a chain of circumstances rather than a single piece of undeniable proof. 3 weeks before the murders, on March 18, 1987, Frances Newton took out a $50,000 life insurance policy on her husband Adrian and a $50,000 policy on her 21-month-old daughter Farah, naming herself as the beneficiary on both. A policy already existed on 7-year-old Alton. She signed Adrian's name on his policy herself. She later admitted to forging his signature, saying she did not want him to find out she had been setting aside money to pay the premiums. At the time of the murders, Frances and Adrian were having serious problems in their marriage. They were still living together in the same apartment, but both of them were involved with other people. Adrian's brother Sterling was also living in the apartment at the time. On the evening of April 7th, Frances asked Sterling to leave for a while so she could talk to Adrian alone about their marriage. Sterling left around 6:45 p.m. A short time later, Adrian received a phone call from a woman he had been seeing. Between 7 and 7:30 that evening, Frances arrived by car at the home of her cousin, Sondra Nelms. Before they left together, Sondra watched Frances take a blue bag out of her car and place it inside the abandoned house next door, a house that belonged to Frances's parents. Then the 2 women drove to Frances's apartment. When they arrived, they found all 3 bodies. Frances called 911 immediately. When the deputy arrived, both women were present. The blue bag that Frances had placed in the abandoned house was recovered by investigators. Inside it was a .25 caliber pistol. Ballistics tests conducted in 1987 determined that the bullets recovered from the 3 bodies matched that gun. That connection between the gun Frances had hidden and the deaths of her husband and children was the spine of the prosecution's case. On top of that, the life insurance policies taken out 3 weeks before the murders, the forged signature, the fact that she had collected the money after the deaths and spent it on a car and fur coats, and the fact that no signs of forced entry or struggle were found in the apartment. Frances Newton told investigators a different story from the beginning. She said she had found the gun in the apartment that day and had taken it out of the house because she was worried about having a weapon around. She said she did not know it was the murder weapon. She said a drug dealer named Charlie had killed her family. She said Adrian had been using drugs and had owed Charlie money and that Charlie had come to collect. She held to that story through her arrest, through her 1988 trial, through 18 years of appeals, and through the final moments of her life. Adrian Newton's mother had a response to the Charlie theory that became one of the most reported statements in the case. She said her son did not use drugs. She said there was no Charlie. She said Frances was Charlie. The jury at Frances Newton's trial in 1988 convicted her of capital murder. She was sentenced to death. The lawyer assigned to defend Frances Newton at her original trial was a man named Ron Mock. Mock had a reputation in Houston that became part of the long argument around her case in the years that followed. He had represented multiple defendants who ended up on death row. His preparation for the original trial was later described by Frances Newton's appellate attorneys as inadequate in basic ways. Witnesses not interviewed, evidence not pursued, alternative explanations not developed. The Texas State Bar eventually disciplined him for unrelated issues. Whether the quality of her original defense was strong enough to have given the jury a real picture of the case is something her later attorneys argued was not. The courts that reviewed those arguments determined that the trial had nonetheless met the legal standard required. For the next 17 years, the legal machinery moved slowly and consistently against her. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals reviewed her case in 1992 and found the conviction sound. Federal courts reviewed it. Each time, the conclusion was the same. The evidence was sufficient. The trial had been conducted properly. The death sentence stood. Then, in November 2004, Frances Newton had a new attorney named David Dow. Dow began examining the evidence and found something that had not been properly examined before. During the original 1987 investigation, investigators may have recovered not 1, but 2 or possibly 3.25 caliber Raven Arms pistols. If that was true, then the certainty that the specific gun Frances had hidden was the murder weapon became far less certain. Dow argued that it was impossible to know which gun had actually been tested and whether the prosecutors had been truthful in their claim that only one gun was ever found. At the same time, a critical piece of physical evidence had been destroyed through mishandling. Frances Newton's skirt had been a key item. It had been tested for gunshot residue in 1987, and the results had been used at trial. By the time the case was being re-examined in 2004 and 2005, the skirt had been stored inside a sealed bag together with the bloody clothing of the victims. That storage method had contaminated it beyond the point where any additional testing was possible. The item was gone as a source of reliable information. This mattered because the crime lab that had conducted the original testing, the Houston Police Department Forensic Crime Lab, was, at exactly this same moment in history, under serious public scrutiny for the way it handled evidence. An independent review of the lab by a former United States Justice Department official found that the city and the police department had failed to give the lab enough resources for at least 15 years before its problems became public. The lab's DNA division had already been found to have serious failures. Questions were being raised about the reliability of the lab's ballistics work as well. The broader context of the Houston Crime Lab in the years leading up to Frances Newton's execution was difficult for Texas to ignore. Cases had been overturned. People who had spent years in prison on the strength of evidence processed by that lab had walked out because the work could no longer be trusted. Outside reviewers had documented contamination, poor record keeping, and analysts performing tasks they were not properly trained for. None of that was disputed at the time her final appeals were being filed. What was disputed was whether those problems extended specifically into the ballistics work performed in her case in 1987, and whether the specific gun analysis used to convict her could still be considered reliable. Frances Newton's case sat directly in the middle of all of that. The key physical evidence connecting her to the murders had come from a lab that was now publicly acknowledged to have had systemic problems. Her defense team raised this in their appeals. The courts reviewed it and determined that the specific ballistics testing in Newton's case had been conducted properly, regardless of the broader failures at the lab. The appeals were denied. In December 2004, Texas Governor Rick Perry granted a 120-day reprieve, a temporary pause on the execution, specifically to allow time for additional ballistics testing to be completed. That reprieve was significant. It was an acknowledgement that there were enough questions around the evidence to justify another look. A defense expert named Frederick Tulliners issued a report in February 2005 following the new round of testing. The state's conclusion from the same testing was that the results confirmed the earlier findings, that the gun Frances had hidden was the murder weapon. Dow continued to argue that the chain of evidence was too compromised to establish that with any certainty. In August 2005, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals turned down a motion for a stay of execution. It turned down another appeal in September. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles voted 7-0 on September 12th not to recommend that the sentence be changed to life imprisonment. The United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit refused her appeal the same day. On September 13th, the United States Supreme Court declined without dissent to hear two separate appeals on her behalf. Over 12,000 people had contacted Governor Perry's office asking him to stop the execution. 10 people had contacted his office in support of it. On September 14, 2005, Frances Newton was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. She was 40 years old. She made no final statement. She had no last meal request. She became the first black woman executed in Texas since before the Civil War. She was the third woman executed in Texas since the reinstatement of capital punishment, following Carla Faye Tucker in 1998 and Betty Lou Beets in 2000. Adrian Newton's parents had written to the governor asking for clemency on the grounds that they opposed capital punishment. They were clear, however, that they believed Frances had killed their son. Roughly 300 protesters gathered outside the prison. Another 75 protested outside the governor's mansion in Austin. Organizations including the Texas Death Penalty Abolition Movement and several civil rights groups had been pushing for a halt to the execution for months. None of it was enough. The case of Frances Newton sits in the record of American capital punishment with a specific and unresolved difficulty. The state of Texas was certain enough to execute her. The courts were unanimous in their determination that the evidence supported the conviction, and yet the central piece of physical evidence, the gun, came from a crime lab later found to have serious systemic problems. The other key item, the skirt, was rendered untestable by the way it was stored. The question of whether there was one gun or multiple guns was never definitively closed. A member of the jury that convicted her later expressed concern about evidence that had not been presented during the trial. The 18 years between her trial and her execution were not silent years for Frances Newton herself. She wrote letters from death row. She maintained contact with family members. She talked to the attorneys who took up her case in the later stages and walked them through her version of events repeatedly, line by line, year after year. The story she told never shifted in its essentials. The same names, the same sequence, the same insistence that the gun in the bag had been something she found, not something she had used. Some people who came to know her during those years were persuaded that she was telling the truth. Others were not. What is on the record is that she did not change her account, not when it would have helped her in plea discussions earlier in the process, not when it might have softened her presentation to a jury, and not at the end when she was asked whether she had a final statement and chose to say nothing rather than to confess. Whether Frances Newton killed her husband and her 2 children for $100,000 in life insurance money is something the courts decided in 1988. Whether the courts were right is something the evidence, as it stands today, cannot answer with total certainty. Both of those things are part of the same case, and the execution that happened in 2005 did not resolve the second one. What can be said is this: a 21-year-old mother drove to her cousin's house, placed a bag in an abandoned building, drove back to her apartment, found her husband and her 2 children dead, and called 911. Whether she put the gun in that bag before the murders or after them is the question on which everything else depends. She said after, the state said before. The state prevailed. Farrah Newton was 21 months old. Alton Newton was 7. Adrian Newton was 23. All 3 of them are buried. Frances Newton maintained until the moment she died that she did not kill them. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The cases up to this point have followed a particular pattern: a woman, a crime, a conviction, a death chamber. The case that comes next breaks the pattern in a specific way. Marilyn Plantz did not pull any trigger, or mix any poison, or smother anyone with her own hands. She was asleep in her bed, by her own account, while it happened. She was in the house. Her children were in the house. And the man being beaten to death in the other room was her husband. Section 6. Marilyn Plantz. While the children were sleeping. Marilyn Plantz was in the house when it happened. That is the detail her defense returned to repeatedly during her trial. That she had been asleep in her bed. That her children had been asleep in their beds. And that whatever took place in another part of the house that night had happened without her direct participation. She did not swing the bats. She did not drive the truck. She did not pour the gasoline or strike the match. What she did, according to the prosecution, and according to the testimony of the people who carried out the killing, was plan all of it, arrange all of it, and give the order that turned a beating into a burning. James Plantz came home from work on a night in August 1988 and walked into his house in Oklahoma. 2 young men were waiting for him. Their names were Clifford Bryson and William McKimble. Bryson was a teenager. He was Marilyn Plantz's boyfriend. McKimble was his friend. Both of them had been brought to the house by an arrangement Marilyn Plantz had made, an arrangement built around a promise of approximately $300,000 in life insurance money that would be paid out when James Plantz was dead. Bryson and McKimble attacked James Plantz with baseball bats. They beat him inside his own home while, in other rooms, his wife and children were supposedly sleeping. The beating was severe, but it did not kill him quickly enough. At some point during the attack, Marilyn Plantz got up. She came to where the men were and she looked at her husband. Then she told them to burn him. She told them that burning would make it look like an accident. Bryson and McKimble took James Plantz, who was still alive at this point, and drove him to a deserted location away from the house. They doused him and his pickup truck with gasoline. They set the truck on fire with James Plantz inside it. He died there. Marilyn Plantz was 27 years old at the time of the murder. She was executed by the state of Oklahoma on May 1st, 2001. She was 40. 13 years passed between the night James Plantz was beaten in his own home and the night the state of Oklahoma administered the lethal injection that killed his wife. To understand what happened and why it happened, the case has to be examined in its full shape, rather than just its most dramatic moments. Marilyn Plantz had been involved with Clifford Bryson for some time before the murder. Bryson was a teenager. The relationship itself was something prosecutors pointed to when constructing the picture of Marilyn Plantz that the jury eventually accepted, a woman who had drawn young men into her orbit and was willing to direct them toward extreme acts. James Plantz himself was a worker for a newspaper company in Oklahoma City. He worked night shifts. His schedule was the reason the plan took the shape it did. The timing of the attack depended on when he would be coming through the door, and a man who worked nights came home at predictable hours. The people waiting for him knew exactly when to be in the house, and exactly how long they had before anyone else was likely to come or go. The Plantz home, in the version of events that came out at trial, had become a place where the husband's own routine was being used to plan his death. James Plantz had been a husband and a father in that house for years. He had worked his shifts, he had come home in the early hours, he had slept while his children went to school and woken in the afternoon to spend whatever time he could with them before the next shift began. The rhythm of a night shift worker's family life is not the rhythm of an ordinary household. The hours are flipped. The presence of the working parent is offset from the presence of everyone else. James Plantz's family had built their daily life around those hours, and the people who planned his death had built theirs around the same hours from the opposite direction. The plan that led to James Plantz's death was not spontaneous. It was discussed. It was arranged. McKimble would later accept a plea agreement in exchange for his testimony, meaning he agreed to testify truthfully about what happened in exchange for a lesser sentence. His testimony was detailed and direct. He described the arrangement Marilyn Plantz had made, what she had promised them, and what happened inside that house and afterward. He described her getting up from her bed and giving the order to burn the body. The plea agreement McKimble accepted was the kind of arrangement that capital cases often hinge on. Prosecutors offered him the chance to avoid the death penalty in exchange for full cooperation. He took it. From the moment he agreed to testify, the case against Marilyn Plantz and Clifford Bryson had a witness who had been physically present in the house on the night of the murder and who was prepared to walk a jury through the planning and the execution of it step by step. Without that testimony, the case the prosecution had been building from physical evidence and insurance records would have been considerably weaker. With it, the structure of what had happened became clear enough that 2 of the 3 people involved were sentenced to die for it. McKimble received a life sentence for his role. He testified against both Marilyn Plantz and Clifford Bryson. Bryson was tried alongside Marilyn Plantz. Both were convicted. Bryson was also sentenced to death. He was executed in 2000, a year before Marilyn Plantz. The element of this case that is most difficult to process quietly is the children. They were in the house. They were asleep, or at least they were in their beds. Their father was being beaten to death somewhere else in the same building. Their mother was awake at some point during the attack, awake enough to get up, walk to where it was happening, look at the situation, and give an instruction. After that instruction was given and James Plantz was driven away to be burned, Marilyn Plantz went back to bed. Or at least, that is the shape of events as the testimony described them. What those children knew, what they heard, what they understood at the time or came to understand later, none of that is part of the court record in the way that the testimony of the participants is. The children were not witnesses in the legal sense. They were present, they were asleep, and when morning came, their father was gone. There were 2 children in that house, a son and a daughter, both young at the time, both old enough to have memories of their father. After the murder and after their mother's arrest, The children entered the kind of life that the relatives of every person on this list have entered, in one form or another. A parent gone, another parent in a courtroom and then in a cell. Grandparents or aunts or family friends figuring out, often without warning, how to absorb children whose lives had just been split in half. The children of Marilyn and James Plantz did not testify at the trial. They did not have to, but the consequences of what had happened in their house arrived in their lives regardless, and they had to keep living through those consequences long after the legal proceedings ended. The prosecution's case relied heavily on McKimball's testimony, on the life insurance policies that formed the financial motive, and on the overall structure of the plan as it had been described by participants. The defence argued that the picture being painted of Marilyn Plantz was constructed primarily by people who had every reason to shift as much blame as possible onto her in exchange for their own reduced sentences. When a person agrees to testify against a co-defendant in exchange for a lighter punishment, their testimony carries a built-in question about how much of it is shaped by self-interest. That question was raised during the trial. The jury considered it and convicted her anyway. The defence at trial also raised the question of how a woman who had not physically struck her husband and had not physically driven him to the field where he was burned could be considered as responsible under the law as the men who had done those things. The legal answer in Oklahoma at the time was that planning a murder, arranging the participants, and giving direction during the act made a person responsible for the result. The jury accepted that answer. The death sentence reflected it. The life insurance motive is worth examining on its own because it recurs so consistently across the cases in this video. Velma Barfield stole money to fund her addiction. Judy Buenoano killed for insurance payouts across a decade. Betty Lou Beets buried 2 husbands on her property after collecting their insurance. Frances Newton was convicted of killing her family for $100,000 in combined policies. Now Marilyn Plantz, who orchestrated the death of her husband for approximately $300,000 in life insurance. The specific amount, $300,000, is what was promised to Bryson and McKimball as their payment for the murder. The actual value of the policies on James Plantz's life was the figure that made the entire arrangement financially logical from Marilyn Plantz's perspective. At least in theory. Whether the plan ever had a realistic chance of succeeding without detection is a different question. Murders arranged for insurance money, with multiple participants who know the full details, and carried out in the victim's own home, with the victim's own family present in the building, tend to unravel. This one unraveled because McKimball, when faced with a capital murder charge, made the decision that his best option was to tell investigators everything he knew. Once McKimball talked, the structure of the case became clear very quickly. The arrangement, the promises, the night of the murder, the order to burn, all of it was on record. Marilyn Plantz and Clifford Bryson were arrested and charged. The trial produced a death sentence for Marilyn Plantz in 1989. The years of appeals that followed moved through the Oklahoma courts and the federal courts steadily. Each appeal raised arguments about the fairness of her trial, the reliability of the testimony against her, and the circumstances of her life and history. Each appeal was denied. Across those years, she remained on Oklahoma's death row. The state did not execute many women, and the small population of women on its death row meant that her time there was spent in a unit with very few other people in her exact situation. The years passed in the way they pass for anyone serving a long sentence inside a system that has scheduled their death. Letters came and went. Family visited or stopped visiting. The legal team filed motions. Decisions came back. The dates approached and were pushed back and approached again. Whatever Marilyn Plantz thought about what she had done, or about what had been done to her by the system, she kept it inside the small set of communications that prison life allows. Nothing she said publicly during those years changed the trajectory of the case. The conviction held, the sentence held. The execution date eventually arrived. On May 1, 2001, the BBC reported her scheduled execution under a headline that described an Oklahoma woman facing death. Marilyn Plantz was brought to the execution chamber. She was given the lethal injection. She was 40 years old. Clifford Bryson, who had physically swung the bat, had been executed a year earlier in 2000. William McKimble, who had also been present for the beating and had helped drive James Plantz to the location where he was burned, received a life sentence in exchange for his cooperation with the prosecution. He did not face the execution chamber. Whether the fact that the people who physically committed the violence were treated differently by the legal system, one executed, one given life, represents something meaningful about how the system weighs participation against orchestration is a question the case leaves open. What the case does not leave open is the basic sequence of events. James Plantz came home. 2 young men were waiting. Marilyn Plantz was in the house with her children while it happened. She got up. She gave an order. Her husband was taken away and burned alive. She went back to bed. Whatever happened inside that house on that night, whatever was heard or felt or understood by the children sleeping in their rooms, the morning came and James Plantz did not. The wishing well had already taken 2 of Betty Lou Beets' husbands. The blue bag had already hidden what Francis Newton may or may not have done. The baseball bats and the burning truck had already ended James Plantz. The cases in this video share a structural similarity that goes beyond motive or method. In almost every one of them, the worst moment happens somewhere close to the children. In the same apartment, in the next room, in the same house. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The case that follows Marilyn Plantz's is the one that most directly involves a son, a case where a mother took action because she believed her son was being threatened, and where the line between protection and murder collapsed completely in a way the courts ultimately decided there was no coming back from. Section 7. Lois Nadine Smith. What a mother calls protection. Lois Nadine Smith had a son named Greg. She loved him. By every account available in the record of her case, that love was real, and it was the central fact of her life, in the way that a parent's love for a child often becomes the organizing principle of everything they do. Greg Smith was her boy. She was his mother. And in July 1982, when she became convinced that a young woman named Cindy Bailey was a threat to her son's life, Lois Smith decided to act on that belief in a way that the state of Oklahoma determined was murder in the first degree. She was executed on December 2, 2001. She was the 3rd woman executed in Oklahoma in the space of 8 months. Wanda Jean Allen in January, Marilyn Plantz in May, and now Lois Nadine Smith in December. Oklahoma executed 3 women in a single calendar year, a fact that drew attention at the time from legal observers and death penalty researchers who noted how unusual that concentration was. No other state had come close to that number in any comparable period during the modern era of capital punishment in the United States. 3 women, 1 state, 8 months. Lois Smith was 61 years old when she was executed. She had spent nearly 2 decades on death row. The crime for which she died happened in 1982, which means she lived inside the machinery of the appeals process for 19 years before it finally ran out. 19 years is a long time to exist in the specific kind of suspended reality that death row creates. A life lived inside a sentence, waiting for courts to decide whether the sentence stands or falls, watching years accumulate without resolution. The years she spent in that cell took her from middle age into the early stages of being an older woman. She entered death row in her early 40s. She left it in her 60s. Her hair changed colour. Her body aged. The Oklahoma she had been arrested in had moved through 3 decades of changes outside the prison walls, while she remained inside them. People she had known on the outside grew older or died. The relatives who visited her aged alongside her. Whatever life she had imagined for herself before July 1982 had been replaced by a different kind of life. One measured in legal filings, in dates set and dates moved, in hearings and rulings, and the slow, predictable rhythm of a process that had only one direction it could ultimately go. The basic facts of the case are not disputed in any significant way. On a day in July 1982, Lois Smith and her son Greg picked up Cindy Bailey. Cindy was 21 years old. She and Greg had previously been in a relationship, and by the time of the killing that relationship was over. What had not ended according to Lois Smith, were the threats. She believed, and her defense team argued strenuously at trial and through the appeals process, that Cindy Bailey had been telling people she intended to have Greg killed. Whether those threats were real, whether they were credible, and whether they justified what happened next, were the central questions the jury had to answer. Cindy Bailey was 21 years old. She had been in a relationship with Greg Smith that had ended badly. Whatever had passed between them, whatever words had been said, whatever anger or bitterness or fear had accumulated on both sides of that ended relationship, she was a young woman at the beginning of her adult life. She had family. She had people who loved her. The record of the case is built almost entirely around the question of what she had allegedly said, and whether Lois Smith's response to those alleged words was legally justifiable. What gets lost inside that legal framing is that Cindy Bailey was a person, and she was 21 years old, and she is dead. The Bailey family carried the loss of Cindy through the same 19 years that Lois Smith spent on death row. A 21-year-old daughter does not come back. The court hearings, the appeals, the legal arguments about substance use and impaired judgment and inadequate counsel, none of those proceedings restored anything to the people who had lost her. They went on with their lives because that was the only option available to them. They aged. They had birthdays Cindy never reached. The arc of grief in a family that has lost a young adult child to violence does not resolve in the way that legal proceedings resolve. It changes shape. It moves into different rooms inside the people carrying it. But it does not end on the day a sentence is handed down, or on the day an execution is finally carried out. What happened after Cindy got into the car with Lois and Greg Smith was a confrontation. Lois Smith confronted Cindy directly about the rumours, about what Cindy had allegedly been saying regarding Greg. The confrontation escalated. At some point during what followed, Cindy Bailey was shot 9 times. She was also stabbed in the throat. She died from her injuries. 9 shots, a stab wound to the throat. The degree of violence in the killing was something the prosecution returned to consistently because it spoke to a level of action that went beyond any reasonable claim of self-defense or momentary loss of control. 9 shots is not a moment of panic. 9 shots is a sustained series of deliberate acts. Each shot requires a decision. Each one requires the trigger to be pulled again after the last one. Add the stab wound to the throat, and the picture the prosecution presented to the jury was of a killing that was thorough and intentional, and that did not stop when it could have stopped. Lois Smith's defense team argued that she had been drinking and using drugs at the time, and that her mental state had been significantly altered by those substances. They argued that a woman who was genuinely in full control of her thinking and her actions would not have done what she did in the way she did it. They argued that the substance use, combined with a genuine and deeply felt fear for her son's safety, had produced a situation where the ordinary standards of judgment did not apply in the way they normally would. The argument was not that she had not done it. The argument was that who she was in that moment was not who she was in ordinary life, and that the law needed to account for that difference. The jury rejected those arguments and convicted her of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to death. What makes the Lois Nadine Smith case sit differently from most of the others on this list is the stated reason behind the act. Barfield poisoned people to cover her theft. Buenoano killed for insurance money. Riggs killed her children in the midst of a breakdown so severe she could not separate harm from mercy. Beets shot her husband and buried him in the yard. Newton was convicted of killing her family for insurance. Plantz arranged her husband's murder for a $300,000 payout. Frances Newton stood before the courts for 18 years, saying she had not done any of it. Lois Smith killed Cindy Bailey because she believed Cindy was going to have her son killed. That was the reason she gave. That was the reason her lawyers argued. Whether it was true, whether Cindy Bailey had genuinely made those threats, or whether Lois Smith had constructed or exaggerated the danger in her own mind, is something the record cannot settle with certainty. What the record shows is that a 21-year-old woman was shot 9 times and stabbed in the throat after being picked up in a car by her ex-boyfriend's mother. The mother-son relationship at the centre of this case is the element that distinguishes it most sharply from everything else in the list. Every woman in this video was a mother, but most of them committed crimes that harmed people connected to them through marriage, romantic partnership, or their own children. Lois Smith committed her crime for her son, or at least that is the account she gave, and that her lawyers pressed. The violence was directed outward, at someone she identified as a threat to him, rather than inward at the family itself. Whether that distinction matters morally is a question without a universal answer. A dead 21-year-old woman is a dead 21-year-old woman, regardless of the reason she was killed. Cindy Bailey's family did not receive a different kind of grief, because the person who killed her was motivated by maternal protection rather than personal gain. The loss was the same. The violence was the same. 9 shots and a stab wound to the throat are 9 shots and a stab wound to the throat. The courts determined that the reason did not change the legal outcome. First-degree murder in Oklahoma carried the possibility of death. The jury found that the specific facts of the case, the level of violence, the deliberate nature of the act, the number of times Cindy was shot, justified the ultimate sentence. The appeals process across 19 years raised multiple arguments. Among the most significant was the claim that the legal representation Lois Smith received at her original trial had been inadequate. Capital defense is a specialized area of law, and the quality of an attorney in a death penalty case has been shown across dozens of cases to have a direct impact on whether a person lives or dies. Her attorneys during the appeals process argued that critical information about her background, her mental state, and the context of the crime had not been properly presented to the jury at trial. The Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals reviewed her case more than once and did not find these arguments sufficient to overturn the conviction or the sentence. The federal courts reviewed the case as well. Arguments were made about the instructions given to the jury during the trial, specifically about whether the jury had been properly guided on how to weigh the mitigating factors in her background and the circumstances of the crime against the decision about whether to impose death. Those arguments were examined and rejected. By 2001, with the United States Supreme Court declining to intervene, the legal process had reached its end. Every court that had jurisdiction to review the case had reviewed it. Every argument her attorneys had available had been made. None of it had been enough. There is something that runs through all the cases in this video and that the Lois Smith case makes particularly clear. The law treats the act. It measures the violence, the intent, the planning, the outcome. It does not measure the love underneath the act, or the fear, or the distorted logic that turns one thing into another inside a mind under extreme pressure. The law cannot measure those things, and arguably, it should not try. But they are present in every one of these cases, whether the case is Velma Barfield's addiction, or Christina Riggs's depression, or Lois Smith's conviction that she was protecting her child. She was brought to the execution chamber at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester on the night of December 2, 2001. She was 61 years old. 19 years had passed since the morning in July 1982 when Cindy Bailey had been shot 9 times in a confrontation that Lois Smith described as protection and the state of Oklahoma described as murder. The lethal injection was administered. She was pronounced dead. Her son Greg was alive when it happened. He had been connected to the events of that day in ways the record documents without fully specifying at every point. What those 19 years looked like for him, what it meant to be the reason given for the crime, to carry the knowledge of what his mother had done in his name, and then to watch the state execute her for it, is not something the court record captures. It is there in the background of the case, unresolved, the way certain things in cases like this always remain. Whatever Greg Smith carried out of that day in July 1982 stayed with him for the rest of his adult life. He was not a child when his mother killed Cindy Bailey. He was a young man, old enough to be in an adult relationship that had ended, old enough to understand what was being done and why his mother said she was doing it. He went through the trial knowing that the central justification offered by the defense rested on the claim that his mother had been protecting him. He went through the appeals process across 19 years knowing the same thing. And on the night of the execution, he was a man in his 40s or 50s, watching the state of Oklahoma carry out a sentence that traced back to a day when his name had been at the center of his mother's stated reasoning. The case took something from the Bailey family. It took something from him too. The exact shape of what it took from each of them is private to those families, and is not the kind of detail that ends up in published court documents. 3 women executed in Oklahoma in the year 2001: Allen, Plantz, and Smith. 3 separate cases, 3 separate crimes, 3 separate juries, 3 separate death sentences, all carried out in the same 12-month window. The accumulation of those 3 executions in a single state in a single year remains one of the more striking statistical facts in the modern history of capital punishment in the United States. No commentary from Oklahoma's government at the time suggested there was anything unusual about it. The machinery ran. The dates came. The executions happened. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case moves the story forward 9 years to 2010 and across the country to Virginia, a state that had not executed a woman in nearly a century. A woman with an IQ of 72 who was called the mastermind of a murder by a judge, while the 2 men who physically carried out the killing received life sentences. A woman whose final words were directed at the daughter of the man she had helped to murder, and a case that drew formal protests from the European Union, from France, and from Iran. 3 entirely different governments agreeing on one thing: that what Virginia was about to do was wrong. Section 8. Teresa Lewis, the one who got death while the killers got life. Teresa Lewis was 41 years old when the state of Virginia executed her on September 23, 2010. She was the first woman put to death in Virginia in nearly 100 years. The last woman executed there before her had been a 17-year-old girl named Virginia Christian, who died in the electric chair in 1912. Nearly a century separated those 2 executions. When Teresa Lewis died by lethal injection at Greensville Correctional Center near Jarrett, Virginia, she brought that century of separation to a close. She was also a mother. She had children. She became a grandmother while she was on death row. Her final words were directed not at her own family, but at the daughter of the man she had helped to murder, a woman named Kathy Clifton, who was present in the execution chamber and who watched Teresa Lewis die. Teresa's final words were, "I just want Kathy to know I love her, and I am very sorry." Kathy Clifton was the daughter of Julian Lewis, Teresa's husband, whose death Teresa had arranged. She had also lost her brother, C.J. Lewis, in the same attack. She had come to the execution chamber to witness it. Teresa Lewis, in her final conscious moments, looked toward the woman who had lost her father and her brother because of what Teresa had done, and she said she loved her and she was sorry. Whether that means anything, whether sorry carries any weight after something like that, is not something the record can answer. Kathy Clifton had said publicly before the execution that she had forgiven Teresa Lewis and had not asked for the death penalty. She also said that when it was over, she would know Teresa could never harm anyone again, and that she would be able to close the door on that chapter of her life. The door closed at 9:13 p.m. on September 23, 2010. Teresa Wilson Bean Lewis was born on April 26, 1969. She grew up in Virginia and did not have a significant criminal history before the events of October 2002. She had children. She had worked in a textile factory in Danville, Virginia. By the accounts of people who knew her before the murders, she was not someone who registered as dangerous or calculating in any obvious way. She was a woman living an ordinary life in a rural part of Virginia, working in a factory, raising her family. In 2000, she met a man named Julian Lewis at that same factory. They married. Julian had an adult son named C.J. Lewis from a previous relationship. C.J. was a member of the United States Army Reserve. He was a young man with a life ahead of him, someone who had signed up to serve his country and who was preparing for the possibility of active deployment. When C.J. was called for active duty, he did what many service members do. He took out a life insurance policy. The policy was worth $250,000. He named his father Julian as the beneficiary. That policy, and the money it would release upon the deaths of both Julian and CJ became the centre of everything that followed. The $250,000 to reach Teresa, both Julian and CJ would have to be dead. Teresa Lewis met two men named Matthew Schallenberger and Rodney Fuller. She began relationships with both of them. She also arranged sex between Fuller and her own daughter, who was 16 years old at the time, in a car park. That detail, a mother involving her teenage daughter in a scheme that led to 2 murders, is one of the most disturbing elements of the case, and one that prosecution and courts cited as evidence of the kind of person they believed Teresa Lewis to be. She offered both men money from the insurance payout in exchange for killing her husband and stepson. Schallenberger later wrote a letter to another woman. In that letter, he described his approach to the arrangement with a coldness that is difficult to read. He wrote that the only reason he had slept with Teresa was to get the insurance money. He wrote that she was exactly what he had been looking for. He described her as someone he knew he could get to fall for him so that she would hand over the money. That letter would later become one of the most significant pieces of evidence in the argument that Teresa Lewis had not been the mastermind of the murders, but the manipulated party, a woman with a very low measured IQ who had been identified and used by a more calculating person rather than the other way around. It was Schallenberger's own words, written in his own hand, that raised the most serious questions about who had actually been directing whom. On the night of October 30th, 2002, Teresa Lewis prayed with her husband Julian before bed. After he fell asleep, she got up, unlocked the front door of their mobile home, and put the family's dog in a separate bedroom so it would not interfere with what was coming. Schallenberger and Fuller entered through the unlocked door. They shot Julian Lewis multiple times with a shotgun as he lay in his bed. They shot CJ Lewis as well. CJ died quickly from his wounds. Julian Lewis did not die immediately. He was still alive when police arrived. His final sounds, recorded in the case documents and cited in legal proceedings, were described as moaning the word baby, repeated. Teresa Lewis was in the home while this happened. She waited 45 minutes after the shootings before calling the police. That 45-minute gap, what she did during it, what she knew, how she felt, became a point of argument during the trial. The prosecution said it demonstrated cold calculation. The defense said it demonstrated the paralysis of a person with limited cognitive function who did not know how to respond to what had just happened. Within a week of the murders, she was caught attempting to withdraw $50,000 from Julian's bank account using a forged check. She was brought in for questioning. She confessed. She told investigators that she had offered money to the two men to commit the murders. The judge who presided over her case called her the head of this serpent. That phrase, the head of this serpent, became the defining judicial characterization of who Teresa Lewis was in the eyes of the law. The prosecution built their capital case around it. Both Schallenberger and Fuller accepted plea agreements in exchange for cooperating with prosecutors. Both received life sentences. Teresa Lewis was convicted at trial and sentenced to death. The two men who physically entered the house, who physically held the weapons, who physically shot Julian Lewis and CJ Lewis as they slept. Both of them received life sentences. Teresa Lewis, who unlocked the door and waited in the house while it happened, received death. That outcome became the central point of debate for the 8 years between her conviction and her execution. Her attorney, James Rocap, argued consistently and publicly that the case was one of the clearest examples of what was wrong with the way capital punishment was applied in the United States. He pointed out that until October 30th, 2002, Teresa Lewis had no record of violent conduct of any kind. He noted that during her time in prison, she had been a model inmate, that she had developed a prison ministry, that she showed genuine remorse, that she had grown into someone who was, by the accounts of people who knew her inside the prison, a different person from the one who had unlocked that door. He argued that a system capable of sparing the men who fired the weapons while executing the woman who arranged the crime was producing outcomes that had no coherent moral logic. The other central issue in her case was her IQ. Testing placed Teresa Lewis at 72. In the 2002 Supreme Court ruling in Atkins v. Virginia, the court had determined that executing people with intellectual disabilities was unconstitutional. States were left to set their own criteria for what that term meant in legal practice. In Virginia, the threshold was generally understood to sit at around 70. Teresa Lewis's score of 72 placed her 2 points above that threshold, close enough that her attorneys argued the distinction was effectively meaningless, that a 2-point difference in a standardized test should not be the line between life and death for a person whose cognitive limitations were otherwise well documented. The courts reviewed this argument at multiple levels. Each time, the determination came back the same. Her score did not meet the legal definition of intellectual disability in Virginia. The execution could proceed. What Schallenberger's letter had introduced, and what the courts ultimately did not find sufficient to change the outcome, was a direct contradiction of the mastermind narrative. The judge had called Teresa Lewis the head of this serpent. Schallenberger, in his own words written to another woman, had described her as a target he had identified and cultivated because she was vulnerable and he could get what he wanted from her. If the judge's characterization was correct, Teresa Lewis was the architect of everything. If Schallenberger's own account was accurate, she was a woman with limited cognitive ability who had been identified by a more dangerous person as someone useful and exploitable. Both things cannot be fully true at the same time. One of them is closer to the reality of what happened. The courts concluded it was the judge's version. Schallenberger died in prison in 2003 from a self-inflicted wound. He could not be further questioned. His letter remained in the record, raising its question without ever receiving an answer that satisfied everyone who read it. The European Union sent a formal letter to Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell asking him to commute her sentence to life. The French Foreign Ministry publicly stated that it deplored the rejection of her clemency petition and the Supreme Court's decision not to hear her appeal. Iran issued a statement against the execution. Over 7,300 people sent appeals for clemency to the governor's office. McDonnell reviewed the materials and declined to intervene. His written statement said he found no compelling reason to set aside the sentence that had been imposed and affirmed by the courts. On September 23, 2010, Teresa Lewis was brought to the execution chamber. Her children had visited her in the days before. She had spent time with them knowing it was the last time. In her final hours she appeared, by the accounts of those present, peaceful and resolved. She looked around the room when she entered the chamber. She lay down on the gurney. She was asked if she had final words. She said what she said about Kathy Clifton. She was pronounced dead at 9:13 p.m. She was the 12th woman executed in the United States since capital punishment was reinstated in 1976. Virginia abolished capital punishment entirely on March 24, 2021, making Teresa Lewis the last person the state of Virginia will ever execute. A fact that carries its own particular weight, given how contested her case was, and how many people across the world had argued that what Virginia was doing was wrong. She had gone to her death as a mother and a grandmother. She had children who had visited her. She had written letters to fellow female inmates at another facility. She had said goodbye to the people she loved, and then been strapped to a gurney and given an injection while the daughter of her murder victim watched from the other side of the class. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The case that follows, Teresa Lewis's, is the one that drew a response from the most powerful religious figure on earth. Section 9. Kelly Gissendaner. The Pope could not save her. Kelly Gissendaner sang Amazing Grace while they were preparing to kill her. She stood in the execution chamber at the Georgia Diagnostic and Classification Prison in Jackson, Georgia, in the early minutes of September 30th, 2015, and she sang. She cried and she prayed and she sang until the lethal injection took hold. Witnesses present for the execution reported that she kept singing until she lost consciousness. Witnesses also said she looked around the room at the people gathered there with something that read as peace, not performance, not a show for the observers, but the genuine quiet of someone who had made her terms with what was about to happen. Her final words before she could no longer speak were addressed to the family of the man she had been convicted of killing. She said, Tell the Gissendaner family I am so sorry. That amazing man lost his life because of me, and if I could take it all back, I would." Then she was gone. She was 47 years old. She was the first woman executed in the state of Georgia in 70 years. The last woman Georgia had put to death before her was a woman named Lena Baker in 1945. 70 years separated those two executions, and everything about Kelly Gissendaner's final hours, the singing, the Pope's letter, the children begging for her life, the cloudy drugs, the winter storm, the repeated delays, made it one of the most watched and most publicly debated executions in recent American history. She was a mother of 3. Her children were alive. They had spent years fighting for her. They had appeared before the Georgia Board of Pardons and Paroles. They had made public statements. They had done everything they could to make the system understand what losing their mother would cost them, on top of what losing their father had already cost them. On the day she was finally executed, they made a choice that no child should ever have to make, whether to spend their mother's final hours at her side or to stand in front of the board and make one last desperate argument that she should be allowed to live. They chose to fight. Her son Brandon spoke to the board on her behalf. The board heard him out. Then they denied the appeal. By the time the decision came back, the window for a final visit had closed. Her daughter Kayla spoke to the board as well. She told them, "My father's death was extremely painful for many people, but I have recently concluded that in many ways I was the person most affected by his murder. The impact of losing my mother would be devastating. I cannot fathom losing another parent." The board did not move. Kelly Renee Gissendaner was born on March 8, 1968, into a poor family in rural Georgia. She grew up with almost nothing in material terms. Sworn statements gathered by her defense team from people who had known her as a child and a teenager described a childhood that carried serious harm. She had reportedly been molested by her stepfather and by other men during her childhood and her teenage years. During her senior year of high school, she reported being raped. 9 months after that report, her first son was born. She was 19 years old. She married a man named Jeff Banks in 1987, but that marriage ended. She then met Douglas Gissendaner. Douglas Gissendaner was a man described by people who knew him, including his own family, and ultimately by Kelly herself in her final statement, as a good man. Kelly and Douglas had a complicated history. They married, separated, divorced, and then made the decision to try again. They remarried in May 1995. By the time of the remarriage, they had a daughter together, and Douglas had become the stepfather to Kelly's 2 sons from her previous relationship. They bought a house together in Auburn, Georgia, in December 1996. They were building something. Less than 2 months after buying that house, Douglas was dead. In the months before the murder, Kelly had been involved with a man named Gregory Owen. Owen was born on March 17, 1971. He and Kelly discussed, according to Owen's own testimony given under oath during her trial, removing Douglas from Kelly's life permanently. Owen suggested a divorce as the obvious solution. Kelly refused. She told him that divorce was not the answer, that the only way to get Douglas out of her life while keeping the house and collecting on his life insurance was to have him killed. Owen testified that this conversation had taken place approximately 3 months before the murder actually occurred. That detail, 3 months of discussion before the act, became important during the trial because it spoke directly to the question of premeditation. This was not a decision made in a moment of extreme emotion or sudden crisis. The plan had been discussed, considered, and maintained across a period of months. The prosecution argued that this demonstrated exactly the kind of deliberate, sustained intent that the death penalty was designed for. On the night of February 7, 1997, Owen hid near the house in Auburn and waited for Douglas to come home from work. When Douglas arrived, Owen forced him at knife point into the car. He drove Douglas to a wooded area near Harbins Park in Gwinnett County. He struck Douglas in the head with a nightstick. Then he stabbed him repeatedly in the neck and in the back. When Kelly arrived at the location shortly afterward, the 2 of them set fire to Douglas's car. They left his body hidden in the woods. Kelly reported Douglas missing the following day. His body remained undiscovered for 2 weeks, until game wardens found it in the woods where it had been left. Investigators began looking at the people closest to Douglas. They identified Owen quickly. He was brought in and he confessed. He agreed to testify against Kelly Gissendaner in exchange for a plea agreement. Prosecutors had offered both Owen and Kelly the same deal before the trials began: plead guilty and receive a life sentence with no possibility of parole for 25 years. Owen accepted immediately. Kelly refused. She demanded a trial and believed she could beat the case. At trial, the picture that emerged was more damaging than a simple account of the crime. During the proceedings, it came to light that Kelly had threatened witnesses during the lead-up to the case. It also emerged that she had plotted to pay someone to commit perjury on her behalf, to lie under oath to protect her from the charges. These details, layered on top of Owen's direct testimony about the planning and execution of the murder, shaped the jury's assessment of who Kelly Gissendaner was and what she was capable of. The jury convicted her and sentenced her to death in 1998. Owen received his agreed life sentence. Kelly Gissendaner was the only woman on Georgia's death row from the moment of her conviction until the day of her execution 17 years later. What happened during those 17 years is the part of the story that generated the most attention and the most genuine disagreement among people who examined the case. She enrolled in a theology program offered through Emory University in partnership with the prison. The program was rigorous and she completed it. She counseled other inmates who were struggling, women who were in crisis, women who felt they had no reason to keep going, women who needed someone to sit with them in the worst moments of their lives. Former inmates gave sworn statements describing what Kelly's presence had meant to them during their time incarcerated. They described her as someone who listened, who helped people find a reason to hold on, who brought a quality to her interactions that they had not encountered in that environment before. Correctional officers, people who worked the facility, who saw the inmates every day, who had every reason to remain neutral, submitted statements supporting Kelly's clemency application. They had watched her over years. What they described was a person who had changed in ways they considered genuine. Hundreds of members of the clergy signed letters asking that her life be spared. The argument these letters made was not that she was innocent. She had never claimed innocence. The argument was about transformation, about whether a person who had committed a serious crime and who had demonstrably become someone different over 17 years inside a prison still deserved to be killed. Whether punishment is supposed to respond only to the crime, or whether it is also supposed to account for who a person becomes after the crime, is one of the oldest unresolved questions in criminal justice. The Kelly Gissendaner case made it unavoidable. The argument from Douglas Gissendaner's family was equally coherent and equally rooted in something real. Their statement before the execution was direct. They said she had been given more rights and more opportunity in the years since the murder than she had ever given Douglas. They said she had shown him no mercy, had given him no choices, and had taken something from their family that no number of theology degrees or reformed characters could give back. They wanted the sentence carried out. Her execution was scheduled 3 separate times. The first date was February 25, 2015. A winter storm moved through Georgia and the execution was postponed. The rescheduled date was March 2, 2015. On that day, as preparations were underway at the prison, officials examined the pentobarbital that was to be used as the execution drug and found that it appeared cloudy. The execution was called off. Later examination determined that the drug had not actually spoiled. It had changed its appearance because it had been stored at a temperature slightly colder than recommended, causing it to separate partially. It was still usable, but the execution had already been stopped for the second time. A third date was set, September 29, 2015. By the time September arrived, the case had drawn attention far beyond Georgia. Pope Francis had just completed a visit to the United States, during which he had addressed Congress directly and called for the abolition of capital punishment. His visit ended days before Kelly Gissendaner's third scheduled execution date. On September 29, 2015, Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano wrote a formal letter to the Georgia Board of Pardons and Paroles on behalf of Pope Francis. The letter asked the board to spare Kelly Gissendaner's life. It said, "While not wishing to minimise the gravity of the crime for which Ms. Gissendaner has been convicted, and while sympathising with the victims, I nonetheless implore you, in consideration of the reasons that have been presented to your board, to commute the sentence to one that would better express both justice and mercy." The board announced shortly after receiving the letter that it would not grant clemency. The Pope's appeal did not change the outcome. A spokesman for the board declined to say whether the board had even read the Vatican letter before making their announcement. Her attorneys filed emergency appeals simultaneously to the Georgia Supreme Court, to a federal appeals court, and to the United States Supreme Court. The Supreme Court rejected 3 separate requests for a stay of execution, 3 distinct applications, reviewed and rejected in the same evening. Each court that received an appeal denied it. The legal roads closed one after another across the hours that followed. Norman Fletcher, the former Chief Justice of the Georgia Supreme Court, the man who had once been the highest judicial authority in the state, had argued publicly that executing Kelly Gissendaner was disproportionate because she had not physically participated in the killing. Fletcher's position was shared by the General Counsel of the Georgia Republican Party, by former Deputy Director of the State Department of Corrections, and by a wide range of legal and religious figures who did not typically align on questions of criminal justice. The agreement among people who disagreed on most things that this specific execution was wrong was notable and was noted. It changed nothing. The execution was delayed by approximately 5 hours as the final appeals worked through the system. At 12:21 a.m. on September 30th, 2015, Kelly Gissendaner was pronounced dead. She had been crying, praying, and singing in the moments before the injection was given. Witnesses said she sang Amazing Grace from the moment they brought her into the chamber until she could no longer sing. She asked God to bless the people in the room. She told the Gissendaner family she was sorry. She lost consciousness mid-prayer. She was the first woman executed in Georgia since 1945. She was the only person executed in the United States in all of 2015. She was also one of a very small number of people executed in the modern era of capital punishment who had not physically participated in the act that killed the victim. Gregory Owen, who had held Douglas at knife point, driven him to the woods, struck him in the head, and stabbed him repeatedly in the neck and back, remained alive in a Georgia prison, eligible for parole. Her 3 children lost their father in 1997. In 2015, they lost their mother. They had chosen to fight for her life instead of spending her final hours with her. They had stood before the board and made the best argument they could and been turned away. The board had moved forward with the execution anyway. Whatever that choice cost them, the choice to fight rather than say goodbye, the knowledge of those lost final hours, sits in the record of the case without resolution. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The last case on this list is the most extreme in almost every measurable way. A federal execution, the first in 67 years for a woman. A mother of 4 who committed her crime precisely because she was terrified of losing her children. A documented history of abuse so severe and so prolonged that it had physically damaged her brain. And a crime so rare and so shocking that it produced a federal death sentence when identical acts committed by other women across the country had produced life sentences. Section 10. Lisa Montgomery, the baby she could not keep. Lisa Montgomery was executed by the United States federal government in the early hours of January 13, 2021. She was 52 years old. She was pronounced dead at 1:31 a.m. at the Federal Correctional Facility in Terre Haute, Indiana. She became the first woman the federal government had executed in 67 years. The last one before her had been a woman named Bonnie Heady, put to death in 1953. That gap, 67 years, tells you something about how rare federal executions of women are, and how extreme the circumstances generally have to be before the federal government decides to carry one out. Lisa Montgomery was a mother. She had 4 children. She had been sterilized in 1990. She later said this happened against her will. meaning she was physically unable to have any more children after that procedure. When she married her second husband, Kevin Montgomery, she did not tell him this. Instead, she told him she was pregnant. She told her friends she was pregnant. She told people in the online community she participated in that she was expecting a baby. She wore maternity clothes. She behaved in every outward way as a woman in the later stages of a pregnancy. She maintained this for months. She was not pregnant. Understanding why requires looking at the life that produced Lisa Montgomery, which is not a comfortable thing to look at. It is documented in court records, in the findings of medical professionals who examined her, and in the work of her defense attorneys, who spent years building a picture of what had been done to her before she did anything to anyone else. Lisa was born on February 27, 1968, in Pierce County, Washington. What followed her birth was not a childhood in any ordinary sense of that word. Her mother began sexually trafficking her when she was a small child. The trafficking was not occasional or ambiguous. It involved allowing adult men to gang rape her on multiple occasions. Her mother told her she had to earn her keep. This began when Lisa was very young and continued through her childhood and into her teenage years. Her stepfather also sexually abused her. The abuse was documented. It was reported at various points to various authorities. None of the institutions that could have intervened, schools, social services, courts, did so in any way that stopped what was happening to her. At 18 years old, Lisa married her stepbrother. The circumstances that produced that marriage are themselves a product of the environment she had been raised in. She had 4 children in 4 years. In 1990, she underwent a sterilization procedure. She later stated that the procedure was performed without her genuine, informed agreement, that she had not fully understood or consented to what was being done to her body. Whether that account is accurate cannot be verified with certainty, but it was documented in her legal filings and accepted as part of her history by the medical professionals who later examined her. Medical professionals who examined Lisa Montgomery after her arrest documented brain damage. The damage was not minor or technical, it was significant and it was measurable. They also diagnosed her with severe mental illness. The specific conditions they identified required antipsychotic medication to maintain her basic connection to reality. Without that medication, the professionals who examined her stated, she would lose the ability to distinguish what was real from what was not. She would lose the ability to understand what was happening around her, or to process it accurately. Critically, the Bureau of Prisons' own doctors, the medical staff employed by the federal government that was seeking to execute her, diagnosed and treated her mental illness while she was incarcerated. There was no credible dispute from any medical source about the existence or the severity of the conditions her attorneys described. The argument was about whether those conditions had been adequately presented at trial and whether they were severe enough to make her execution unconstitutional. After her first marriage ended, Lisa married Kevin Montgomery. Kevin believed she was capable of having children. He believed this because Lisa had not told him the truth. By the spring of 2004, Lisa had told Kevin she was pregnant with their child. She told her friends. She told people online. She wore maternity clothes and attended social events as a pregnant woman. She had constructed a pregnancy that did not exist and was maintaining it in every detail of her daily life. 2 days before the crime, her first husband, the stepbrother she had been married to at 18, filed legal papers seeking custody of 2 of her children. He knew she was not pregnant because he knew about the sterilization. He threatened to use the fabricated pregnancy in the custody proceedings to demonstrate that she was mentally unstable. The threat arrived in a specific and devastating form. He would expose her to the court. He would use it to take her children, and the marriage she had built with Kevin would collapse when the lie came out. The threat of losing her children and the threat of being exposed arrived at the same time, in the same 2-day window, inside a mind that medical professionals would later describe as already severely damaged and detached from reality in ways that ordinary people do not experience. Bobby Jo Stinnett was 23 years old. She lived in Skidmore, Missouri, with her husband Zeb. They ran a dog breeding business from their home, specializing in rat terriers. Bobby Jo was a young woman building a life. She and Zeb were expecting their first child. She was 8 months into her pregnancy. She maintained a website for the dog business and was active in an online community of rat terrier enthusiasts. Lisa Montgomery had met Bobby Jo at a dog show in April 2004. The two women had communicated through the online rat terrier community, a chat forum called Ratter Chatter. Lisa, who was at that time presenting herself to the world as a pregnant woman, had interacted with Bobby Jo online about their shared interest in the dogs and, given the fabricated overlap of their supposed pregnancies, about expecting babies. On December 15, 2004, Lisa Montgomery sent Bobby Jo a message online. She used the name Darlene Fisher. She told Bobby Jo she was from a town near Skidmore and that she wanted to come and look at some of the puppies Bobby Jo had available. Bobby Jo agreed. They arranged for Lisa to visit the following day. That evening, Bobby Jo told her mother and her husband that a woman would be coming to look at puppies the next day. She had no reason to be concerned about the visit. It was the kind of arrangement she made regularly as part of the dog breeding business. On the morning of December 16, 2004, Lisa Montgomery left Melvin, Kansas, and drove to Skidmore, Missouri. She had a sharp kitchen knife and a white cord inside her jacket pocket when she left the house. She arrived at Bobby Jo Stinnett's home at approximately 12:30 p.m. Bobby Jo brought out the puppies. The two women spent time with them. The visit had the appearance of what it was supposed to be, a potential buyer coming to see the dogs. At around 2:30 p.m, Bobby Jo received a phone call from her mother, confirming she would pick her up from work at 3:30 that afternoon. After the call ended, the women went inside. At some point after that, Lisa Montgomery attacked Bobby Jo Stinnett. She used the white cord to strangle her. She kept the pressure on until Bobby Jo lost consciousness. She then used the kitchen knife to cut into Bobby Jo's abdomen. The cutting caused Bobby Jo to regain consciousness. Lisa Montgomery strangled her again, this time until she was dead. Bobby Jo Stinnett was 23 years old. The baby, a girl, was removed from Bobby Jo's body. She had survived. Lisa Montgomery carried her out of the house, got into her car, and drove back to Kansas. She arrived home that evening. She showed Kevin Montgomery the baby and told him she had given birth. Kevin held his daughter. He had no reason to question what he was being told. He had believed the pregnancy all along. That night, Bobby Jo's mother tried to reach her by phone and got no answer. She contacted Zeb. He went to the house. He found his wife. He called the police. The investigation that followed moved with a speed that was, even by the standards of modern law enforcement, striking. Within hours, investigators had traced the online communications between Darlene Fisher and Bobby Jo Stinnett to an IP address in Melvin, Kansas. By the following day, they had identified the address as belonging to Lisa and Kevin Montgomery. Officers drove to the house. When they arrived, they found a car that matched the description of one seen near Bobby Jo's home the previous afternoon. They knocked. Kevin answered and let them in. Lisa was inside, sitting on a couch, holding the baby, watching television. A lead investigator told Lisa he was looking into the death of Bobby Jo Stinnett and asked about the baby. Lisa said she had given birth at a clinic in Topeka. She asked Kevin to get the discharge papers from his truck. He looked. There were no papers. The investigator asked to speak with Lisa outside. She went with him. Kevin stayed inside with the baby. Within an hour, Lisa Montgomery confessed fully. She admitted to killing Bobby Jo Stinnett, removing the baby from her body, and driving back to Kansas with the infant. The baby, Bobby Jo's daughter who had survived what her mother had not, was recovered and returned to Zeb Stinnett. Lisa Montgomery was charged with kidnapping resulting in death, a federal crime because the act crossed state lines. She was arrested on December 17, 2004. She was tried and convicted in 2007. A jury recommended the death sentence on October 26, 2007. She was formally sentenced to death in federal court in April 2008. The case against her in terms of what she had done was straightforward. The evidence was overwhelming, the confession was recorded, and there was no meaningful dispute about the basic facts. What her attorneys disputed, across years of appeals, medical evaluations and legal arguments, was whether the system that had sentenced her to death had ever genuinely grappled with what Lisa Montgomery was and what had been done to her before she did anything to anyone. The Cornell Center on the Death Penalty Worldwide, which examined the case in detail, noted that more than a dozen women across the United States had committed the same type of crime, killing a pregnant woman to take the baby. None of those women had been sentenced to death. Every other person convicted of this specific act received a life sentence. Lisa Montgomery was the only one condemned to die for it. Her attorneys made this argument explicitly in multiple courts, that the application of the death penalty in her case was arbitrary, that identical acts had produced life sentences for others, and that executing her while those other women remained alive was a product of failures in her legal representation and the mishandling of her mental illness at trial, rather than anything that distinguished her crime from theirs. A federal judge agreed with part of this in 2021, vacating her death sentence on grounds of ineffective legal representation, specifically that her trial attorneys had failed to properly present evidence of her mental illness and her history of abuse to the jury. That ruling was quickly reversed by a higher court. The execution was set for December 8, 2020. It was delayed by court orders. It was rescheduled for January 12, 2021, then moved again to January 13th. In the final 72 hours before her execution, courts moved at an unusual speed. Multiple federal judges issued rulings. Some stopped the execution temporarily, others reversed those stops. Her attorneys argued in emergency filings that her mental illness had deteriorated to the point where she could not rationally understand what was happening to her or why, and that executing a person in that condition had been ruled unconstitutional. The courts ultimately did not find this sufficient to halt the proceedings. At 1:31 a.m. on January 13, 2021, Lisa Montgomery was pronounced dead. The 4 children she had given birth to, whose lives had shaped every broken decision she made in the years leading up to December 16, 2004, were alive. The baby girl who had survived what happened in Bobby Joe Stinnett's house was alive and growing up with her father. Bobby Joe Stinnett's family had carried the loss of her for 16 years by the time the execution happened. Both of those truths, the truth of what Lisa Montgomery suffered and what it produced in her, and the truth of what she did to Bobby Joe Stinnett and what it cost that family, exist in the record of the case at the same time. Neither one cancels the other. Neither one makes the other easier to hold. 10 women, 10 cases, 10 death sentences reached across decades, across states, across circumstances that had almost nothing in common except for 2 things. Every one of these women was a mother, and every one of them was put to death by a legal system that had decided, for reasons specific to each case, that the act was more important than everything else. What any of it means, what justice required in each of these cases, whether it was served, whether the right outcomes were reached, or whether some of these women died for crimes they did not commit, or for circumstances the system was never equipped to understand, those are questions the executions did not answer. The executions happened. The questions stayed. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.